Everyone, welcome back to Getting In, a college coach conversation. We've saved perhaps the most important part of today's discussion for last, and that is a conversation around the college list. And joining me to talk about getting that final list set and tied up with a bow is my colleague Zaragoza Guerra. Hi, Zaragoza. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ian. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. And we talk about the college list in a lot of different kinds of ways. And we always use the phrase college list. And sometimes that refers to the long list of probable schools that you might consider as possibilities.
Mhm.
Sometimes it refers to a short list of schools from which you're going to choose the ones to which you'll apply. But we today are talking about that final list of schools. These are places that are going to get your application this fall. These are all schools that you're seriously considering for attendance in the spring. And I think what we want to start with is just some characterization of what that list ought to include. So, what are some stipulations that you would recommend to guide folks as they think about putting that final list together?
Yes, when I'm thinking about that overall final college list, the one with actual applications, the actual, not just contenders, but ones that you're actually submitting your application to, I'm oftentimes reminding students to make sure that they think about strategy here. What is the end game with your college applications? And you want to come out of the process with some choices. You want to
Yes.
be able to decide between schools.
Yes.
And it makes uh, no sense necessarily to apply to 20 school and have to decide between one or two schools. You'd rather have a good number of schools at the end of the day to decide upon. So I'm encouraging students to think not only about what we would call their reaches, those schools that are a bit harder to get into, but those schools where they've got strong probability of
Yeah.
being admitted. That's going to be important to round out your college list with those set of schools. And then those schools where it could go either ways, those schools that are kind of right in the middle. And I think we're generally encouraging students to think about applying to at a minimum 7 schools, okay? And thinking about those 2 probable schools, those 3 possible schools, and maybe those 2 reaches. I think a lot of students might be applying to a lot more schools than just 7, and I think that's absolutely understandable. And sometimes, depending upon a student's list and the admit rates for some of the schools that they're considering, I might encourage them to apply to a few more.
Yeah.
I think where you round out those extra set of schools is going to be dependent upon what your overall goals are. If your goal happens to be, I want to decide upon the best financial aid package I can get, or the best merit aid package I can get, then maybe perhaps you're rounding out a few more probable schools and possible schools because that's where you might get a bit more merit aid. If it
Right.
happens to be that you're gunning for name recognition, chances are you're going to find that name recognition within your reach set of schools. And so it could be that you're applying to a few more of those. So I'd say 10 is, I see oftentimes plenty of students applying to 10, and I think that's absolutely reasonable. It gets tricky when you're starting to apply to a few more
Yeah.
because applying to a few more
Yeah.
can negatively impact the process. It, spending time trying to cover all your bases in the multiverse rather than the one universe we live in, because you can only go to one school. But if
Right.
you're trying to make sure
Right.
that you get into all the Ivies because you'd like to go to all of them, or you'd like to go to all of these incredible state flagships, that might take away time that could be spent writing a quality essay for your
Yes.
school. And
Yes.
those schools aren't going to care how many other schools you apply to. They're only going
No.
to see that one application. And so you want to be able to dedicate as much time to that and make sure that your essays have impact, okay, rather than detract.
It It's not a perfect scale, but we would say that as schools get more selective, the expectations of their supplements tend to increase. The number of words you need to write for them with additional essays will tend to increase. And so the more schools you apply to that are more selective, the more work you're creating for yourself. And oh, by the way, those are schools where sort of rote responses to the essays will not serve you well, right? You really need personal, high quality essays in those spaces, and that's hard to do. So, what I'm hearing from you is 7 to 10 is a real sweet spot in terms of just the raw number of schools, that there may be some students that consider sprinkling a couple more on there, depending on what their priorities are, whether that's maximizing scholarship options or maybe looking at some more selective institutions. But you really have to be careful of letting that list get out of control. And I think it's also worth just underscoring that applying to more selective schools is not the same as buying more lottery tickets, right? If I buy more lottery tickets, I have more chances to win. But applying to more schools does not give me more chances of getting into any one, because the quality of my application is ultimately the measure of my success. And as you said, these schools don't care where else you're applying. They're only evaluating your application for them, for that one school. And I think that's a hard thing for students to wrap their heads around, because it seems to make sense that the more places I apply, the more chance I have, but it doesn't actually work that way.
Doesn't actually work that way. It could also mean that you're going to get many more no's than you
Right.
had anticipated, and you
That's right.
got to be prepared for that. I've seen some students who've, uh, because they're applying to many more places, get many more no's. And I think sometimes if you are losing focus, if a student is losing focus to the point where they're not able to, submit a quality application, they probably are going to get many more no's. I think it's probably best to consider strategy, in terms of your applications. I think there is some strategy involved in terms of the timing of your applications, of a student's applications, that could have a much greater impact than perhaps submitting, you know, oodles and oodles of applications, applying to many more schools, applying to a few select choice schools, okay,
Yeah.
and timing those applications might be a more strategic option for students.
I like the way that you're bringing up strategy, because I think when people talk about strategy in the application process, the way that they think about it is, how do I strategically optimize my chances of getting into any one school? And you're thinking about strategy from an overall perspective, where the goal is to maximize options. The goal is to put a student in a position where they've got schools they're getting into. And the goal is to find the best match for those particular students. And that's very different from, I want to go to Harvard. How do I make the best application for Harvard? There might not be a strategy there. There are some things around the margins that you can work on, but the strategy on the whole that I would say is, well, if you want to go there, let's think about your overall strategy and how Harvard might fit into that conversation.
Mhm.
And I hear you saying that. And I think that that's really, really important. How do you talk to students about making sure that, okay, they've got one school they really love, but what's the level of interest and commitment and knowledge of the other 6 to 9 schools on their list?
I think when you're talking about some schools that happen to be on the uber selective side, perhaps, or maybe they might be on the uber selective side for, it depends on the student, right? Um, what's easy to get into for one student might be difficult for another,
Yes.
depending upon their grades and their test scores. When you're starting to look at those more reach schools, and I'll call them reach schools rather than selective schools, right?
Right.
Um, I think it's important to consider your other set of schools, because a reach school is a reach school because it's difficult to get into, and the odds are not great.
No.
And a student needs to prepare for the fact that they might get a no. And it could be likely that they're going to get a no. And so it's important to look at the other set of schools that one is placing on the list, to not place them on the list simply because you need to place schools
Right.
on the list.
Yeah.
You're placing them on the list because you've done research for those schools, on those schools, and that feel, hey, this is a strong possibility. I could be happy here. And because it could be one of the schools and one of your options at the end of the day. And you got to be happy with the options in front of you. Otherwise, you're not necessarily going to college, right?
That's right.
And um, so strategically, it's great to try to plan for that dream school, but you need a backup plan. Many students are going to have to rely on their backup plans, particularly if their dream school happens to be an uber selective school. Uh, Maybe it's got an admit rate under 5%. The odds are you're not going to get in.
That's right.
Okay. Those are
That's right.
the odds are you're not going to get in. So let's plan for that eventuality. Hopefully it's
Exactly.
not an eventuality. Hopefully it'll surprise you, but you need to be prepared.
That's right. Amy in our first segment alluded to something that I thought was really great. And she was talking about looking at program quality and the match for the student and whether the schools are really strong in the particular programs they're interested in. And what she was underscoring was that there might be schools that are more selective or higher ranked, but for your particular program, a school that is a likely school to admit you is actually a better fit. And it's really interesting when you look at some of these students that are competitive, but perhaps not compelling for the most selective institutions. There's not a really dramatic difference between the schools that are going to be hard for them to get into and the schools that are going to be easier for them to get into. The institutional quality is still quite high. And that's one of the things that I think is hard for students to wrap their head around. If I can get in, well, then I don't know if I want to go there. No, you should want to go there. It's still great, right? Like it's still an awesome option. And the work that you've put in over the course of your high school career has made this a likely school to admit you. So let's celebrate that rather than saying, I'm not interested in you anymore. I got my sights set on the schools that don't necessarily want to admit me. And I think that's really important. We've got only a few minutes. I want to talk about early decision because this is something that people will talk about. They'll say, I've got my list and I need my ED school as well. And when someone comes to you with that statement, how do you counsel them as an expert in this space? I got my list. I got to pick my ED school. Zaragoza, what should we do? Which school should we pick?
Absolutely. The first thing that I'm going to ask a student is, hey, what are your top choice schools? Where are the favorites on your list? Let's see them. What are your top 3, 4, 5 favorites? And then let's see what kind of application, early admission program they have, because not every school is going to have early decisions. Some are going to have early action, some are going to have restrictive early action, some are going to have rolling admission. And so it's best just to know, okay, if your top choice school doesn't even have early decision, then maybe you're not even considering it.
Yes.
Should you consider an early admission process? I think students overall should consider an early admission process. It distributes the work over the calendar, and there are preferences given to those students who submitted their applications on the earlier side, who've demonstrated that they want to go to a school. Even applying early action might demonstrate that for those schools who are paying attention to that. And so, I'm generally encouraging a lot of early admission applications. Whether it's early decision, it depends on what are the favorite schools for that particular student. If their absolute favorite happens to be an early decision school and they know they'd go there without a doubt, then I'm generally encouraging them to apply their early decision, because it does boost the odds of admission. You can see the difference between those schools that post their early admission admit rates versus their regular admission admit rates, and there is a big difference. And so I'm generally encouraging students to do that. I think oftentimes regular admission, it's to your peril if you find yourself in the regular decision pool. I find
It's true.
yeah,
It's true.
so generally try to go for an early school. If your school happens to have, let's say, a restrictive early action policy, think long and hard. Okay. Usually it's the most uber select schools in the country that are going to have a restrictive early action policy, where they're going to restrict where else you can apply early. And that might inhibit
Yeah.
odds of getting admitted to more schools. Okay. And
Yeah.
is that worth, you know, strategy there?
In
Um,
my experience, it's not often worth it to apply restrictive early action unless we take a look at the rest of the list and we see it's actually not cutting off any other opportunities. But if it
Correct.
is, I usually say let's apply regular decision. Is not going to be a
Yeah.
big difference.
Mhm.
And you mentioned those schools that you want to be in the early pool because the regular pool is a bloodbath. That tends to be schools that are not the most selective, but are quite selective. The ones that admit 8 to 17% of their applicants. Those are the spaces where the ED makes the big difference. And so a lot of people will say, well, I got to apply ED to MIT if I want to get in. But it's more like the ED to Northwestern makes the big difference as opposed to the ED to MIT. And it's hard to think about these
Yeah.
rounds and how they are
Yeah.
different for different institutions.
And I mean, yeah, and I'm even encouraging a student to think, perhaps consider multiple early schools. So, if you're applying early decision to Northwestern, Northwestern is not going to inhibit you from applying early action to some other
No,
schools. So
exactly.
send in those applications as well. Try to send in as many as possible. That would be the advice.
And this is great. I mean, on the whole, what I'm hearing is this wonderful sort of global perspective of thinking about all of the possibilities and strategizing from the whole, and that a college list has lots of different parts. And you want to think about all of the schools collectively. And I think that's just such a wonderful reminder for students that are figuring this out. It doesn't just come down to one school until May, but for now, you want to keep as many options on the table as possible.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Zaragoza. Always fun to talk to you about this. I think you're one of the more strategic minded members of our team. And so coming and talking about the list, I think is a real benefit to our listeners.
Oh, thanks, Ian. Glad to be here. It was fun.
Glad to have you. All right. Next week, we're going to be back to talk a little bit about honors colleges, what they are and whether you should apply. For many students, yes, you should. They're great. And we're also going to do some listener questions. So if you've got a question, you can always send an email to gettinginvoiceamerica@gmail.com. We'll be happy to answer that on a future show. I look forward to being back in a couple of weeks. Good luck with September, folks. The deadlines are right around the corner.